you hear us, Darren? Yeah. Okay, thank you. If you're just sitting, I just wanted to make sure that everything was working.
Yeah, it's all working on my end. I'm just
Okay. And we're live.
All right, so I will call the study session to order and on carbon-free electricity production exploration, and it'll be presented by Peter Passerelli and Natalie Rogers.
Thank you, Mayor Gamba and council members. I'm Peter Passerelli, the Public Works Director, and this evening we wanted to give you an update on our discussions we've had with our electric utility PGE about some potential renewable energy products that would benefit the community as a whole. Last summer, we worked with PGE and signed on to a carbon-free energy product that will benefit our local government's operations. And now we've progressed the discussion with PGE to talk about a community-wide energy product. One of the things that we're hoping to get tonight was some guidance from council about some of the design criteria that we would use to develop a potential rate structure with PGE that encapsulates some of our values as a community. So Natalie's put together I think a nice presentation that will go over that and frame the questions we have, and hopefully we have a nice discussion about it. So Natalie?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So I'm Natalie. I'm the Climate Action Sustainability Coordinator for the city. As Peter mentioned, we've been having really great conversations with Portland General Electric, PGE, on how our community can reach the goals outlined in our Climate Action Plan. As we've been having these conversations, we realized that we needed some more direction on some of these kind of complicated topics, just so we can really nail down what we mean when we start offering up potential ideas for product development. And so that's kind of what we're hoping to get from you guys today, as well as provide a little bit of background on some of the topics that we've been talking about, so that way we're all on equal footing when we have these really good discussions. So I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Scott, can you see the screen? Perfect. So today we're here to talk to you about this exploration of this community carbon-free product. And I do just want to reiterate that we're in the exploratory phase right now. We're just discussing this with Portland General Electric, and nothing is concrete, nothing is locked down. This is all conceptual at this point. Okay, so the objectives of today's conversation, we're just going to remind all of us about the 2030 carbon-free goal and some of the conversations and points that we've locked down previously in discussions with council. We're going to introduce you guys to the potential product, just so you can understand why we're asking you these questions. And then we're just going to get a shared understanding of how electricity is generated, transmitted, distributed around the region, and then why these different particularities matter. And then we'll enter into a more robust discussion about this product, and then we'll get your feedback on those questions that you found in the staff report. And then we'll provide a really brief, just kind of pathway moving forward, what we're going to be looking for as staff, and some of the conversations we'll be having in the future. So as a reminder, we have expedited climate goals for the city. By 2030, we're hoping to reach net zero carbon emissions from electricity, 2035 from all building energy, fuel types, and by 2045, we're going to be a completely carbon neutral community. We've come to you guys before with conversations around that 2030 goal and what we mean. From our conversations, we really pinned down that our goal as a community is to provide our community members with carbon-free electricity by 2030. Now, we still need to define a few more things, which is what today's conversation will be about. But this goal is only 10 years away now. And so we're having to move pretty quickly so we can achieve the goals that we've outlined for ourselves. So for that 2030 goal, our past discussions really determined that carbon-free electricity means no carbon at time of generation. Now this can get really complicated, as we explained before, because some renewable energy types, as defined by the state, don't meet this definition that we have set forward for ourselves, including biomass and biofuel. That's because while they may use renewable fuel types, when that electricity is made, it does emit air pollutants and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so that's why we exclude them. Also, past conversations, we said things like nuclear energy. Even though that's a carbon-free electricity type, that's not one that our community is pursuing for our own goals. And then so today's discussion, we really want to start to nail down if there's a location of electricity generation that we would prioritize. A little more information about RECs. We've introduced those in past conversations, but we'll just provide a brief overview of those and why they can get kind of complicated. And then also if there's a generation type that we really care about. There we go. And then so another past conversation we had was about this carbon accounting calculator. And so this was created when we were trying to see the path that we were on, the trajectory we were on with a business as usual situation to achieve our carbon goals as a community for electricity. From doing this exercise, we realized that we have a 40% gap to close in 2030. That's essentially indicating to us that we need local level action in order to achieve our goals. We can't just rely on things like the renewable portfolio standards, so the state requirement to increase renewables in the grid mix. We also need to pursue other levers of change, which is what we see here. We brought to you that there's elements of energy conservation that we can take at a local scale and elements of energy efficiency, but really energy source is at the top of that pyramid. And one of the actions that we brought to you was a community tariff, essentially a community scaled electricity product that would help us achieve that goal. And that's why we're here today to talk to you more about it. So when we were exploring this potential carbon-free product with PGE, this interest really, so there's a national interest in a potential opt-out renewable product framework. You may have heard of the Utah Community Renewable Energy Act, HB 411, which essentially allows communities to work with their utility to create an opt-out model rather than an opt-in model where people have to sign up for renewable energy. This says a community within a jurisdiction can say, hey, our community values are such that we want people to automatically be enrolled if they open up an account within our jurisdiction, and then they can choose to opt out of that pathway if they so choose. This spurred some regional interest. We kind of convened a community group of local municipalities and counties to talk more about it. And people were pretty interested in this topic and in a potential framework similar to Utah within Oregon. We let PGE know we were talking about this with other communities, and PGE wanted to be an active participant in those conversations. And this kind of is one of the reasons why this product is being explored right now. We've also had discussions with PGE, the Oregon Public Utility Commission, and other regional communities. But these conversations really highlighted the opportunity and advantages for community scale products, working through existing utility partners rather than pursuing something like community choice aggregation, municipal electric utilities, et cetera. Essentially, we get a lot of value of having a very active utility partner like PGE, especially at a community our scale. And so we think that if there's a path moving forward working with PGE, it would be to our advantage at this point.
If I could add one additional thing. So Natalie talked about the discussions that we're having with the other regional communities. The one thing that I would share with the council on that is one of the things that we've found is we are probably further ahead in trying to develop a product. And in terms of what our needs are for the community, what our future needs are. I think we're probably the only community that I know of within the region that have developed this carbon calculator, and they're using that as a tool to identify what that gap is and trying to define how we're going to get there, trying to put that pathway forward to get there by 2030.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's, we've had conversations more explicitly with City of Portland about this product. And we've also reached out and talked to Beaverton briefly, as well as a few other communities in those regional discussions. And it sounds like we are trying to find answers to more detailed questions than other communities are at this point. And that's simply because we are interested in moving faster. I think we are spending more time on trying to figure out this community scale solution. And I think that PGE is definitely aware that Milwaukee wants to move forward quickly on this. And so that's why we're having these really great discussions at the point we are in now.
But I have a question actually about that. So Portland has roughly the same goal that we have. What's their plan?
So Portland right now, talking to their staff, it sounds like they are spending a considerable amount of time working on their climate emergency declaration at this point. They also have more community-based organizations involved at a more robust engagement process with those community-based organizations. And so they, I believe, are trying to make a slow and measurable step forward. And right now, their priority is getting that climate emergency declaration passed. They're having conversations with PGE about this. They are not putting it off, as far as we can tell. They're just taking a more slow approach to it.
I think the scale for Portland makes it a little bit more difficult for them to gain a lot of traction and get moving quicker on this than it does for us.
This is one of the few times that it's easier for us to be a small community. So we're just able to be a little more nimble, but we haven't heard anybody tell us that they're not interested in the legislation or the path. It's whether or not they want more amendments to the path, I think. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, definitely. And they definitely, so, Portland has been working on the Portland Clean Energy Fund, and they've taken a really unique position in that arrangement where it's being led by a coalition of community-based organizations. And because that inherently has more voices at the table, they need longer time periods, I believe, to really make decisions. And so I think they just want to make sure that they're getting that input from those groups before they move forward on any decision making.
Are there some concerns that we should be aware about? I'm just kind of wondering, if you've got some examples of things that, maybe we're not talking about here that.
No, I don't think that there's any concerns, and the fact is actually we're having a conversation about these things that they will be having conversations about as well. We're just having them right now, and then they are working on their climate emergency declaration, and then they will likely be bringing these discussion points to these groups at a later date.
Well, it seemed from the end of your staff report, I noticed the city manager just mentioned legislation. From the end of your staff report, I read it to mean that a legislative track may be required, but we're trying to explore whether the Public Utility Commission can provide us with a track where we don't have to go for legislation.
Yeah. Yeah, so right now, the phase that we're in right now is just simply saying this is the ideal type of product that we'd like PGE to look into what would cost. So our community, our climate action plan outlines that we want carbon-free electricity. And then in our past conversations with council, it says this carbon-free electricity can come from these generation types. Portland is still in that process of defining those goals.
Well, so we defined them tonight. And PGE said tomorrow, oh yeah, we can do that. I know it's not going to be that smooth, but let's say they did say that. Don't we have are there legal questions that still have to be ironed out about how we go about it?
shortly, we don't know. We've asked the PUC to what their opinions are on legislative requirements. They're looking into it. PGE is also looking into it. And we'll talk more about this at the end of this presentation. But, there's two paths forward. One is simpler, going through the PUC, developing a product really similar to Green Future Impact, which is a tariff product, which we're participating in already. And the other one would essentially say that we need legislation that says they're allowed to develop a product like that. And we're just waiting on more information at this point. Right now, this discussion, all we're saying is that this is our ask of PGE, and so we need clarification to say, what are we asking of PGE to even start to look at what would cost? It's kind of like developing your shopping list before you go out to the grocery store is kind of what we're doing right now.
Natalie, can I ask one more question? Has there been any engagement with any communities that are in Pacific Corps territory?
Yeah, I've talked to Hood River. We had a call with our regional community group earlier this month, and Bend, sounds like Bend and Corvallis are their two other Pacific Power communities. Weren't able to attend that call, but I did talk to Hood River, Marla Harvey and Hood River, and it sounds like they are having some conversations with Pacific Power, but I don't think it's as deep as we are getting right now with PGE. I know Pacific Power is aware of this simply because Pacific Corps is also, working with HB 411 in Utah. So I don't know if they're just waiting on seeing what's happening with our communities or if they're just taking a more conservative approach to it. I'm not sure.
I was just curious because that helps inform if we do go a legislative direction, just knowing whether or not they're tracking it. I know they're paying attention in Utah, obviously, but they're obviously big players at the state level.
The staff person in Bend has also been involved in past conversations. They have a MOU similar to what we're talking about tonight with Pacific Corps, and they are interested. I know that they actually received information from Park City before we did in our group setting. So it won't be a surprise at LOC if you're talking about this.
Right.
And Multnomah County, which does have a small percentage in Pacific Power territory, they are active in this conversation as well. So I would be surprised if they didn't bring it up to them at some point.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. And then just from this potential carbon-free product, our end goal is to have some sort of opt-out carbon-free product offered at a lower cost than the current residential products. And that's simply just because we want to combine our goals of affordability as well as our carbon goals for our climate action plan. And then just to reiterate, this conversation, we're just exploring something right now. Nothing is really locked down. So I just want to give a brief overview of electricity generation and delivery. So this is a really complex topic, and I apologize that you guys have to try to learn it in a brief amount of time. But pretty much, electricity is generated at oftentimes a different location than where the customer is. So you can see on the left, there's this figure about how you have your generation site, and it goes through a transmission process of these lines which occur at vast distances. And then you have different distribution stations that allow for delivery of power at different voltages. So commercial entities will take power at a different voltage in our residential centers. And so these transmission lines, if you see on the right, this lighter blue is PGE's territory or service area. And then you can see how the plants for generation fall outside of their service territory. And that's because they can have these transmission lines that deliver the power to their customers. And so even though this falls outside of PGE service territory, it's still generation sites owned by PGE. Power companies can also enter into agreements to purchase power from other generation sites that are not owned by the utility. The real key factor is these transmission lines, which have interties, and we'll have a slide all over the nation, essentially. But so electricity is managed at these varying extents. So on the left, we have the largest extent we would consider, that's the Western Electric Coordinating Council. You can see it's pretty much a good third or more of the continental U.S. This is how we get power from, Utah, Nevada, et cetera, marketable power that enters into PGE's customer service territory. You can see even zooming in, those red lines on this area in the Pacific Northwest, those are BPA, Bonneville Power Administration transmission lines where electrons, the electricity, can get sent through from different generation facilities. And then while we zoom in even further, that's our PGE service territory, which is actually surprisingly small for what a lot of folks consider. But they, like I said, have generation plants that are outside of their service territory. So electricity is managed at varying extents. And then we also have a variety of generation sources which are contributing those electrons into the grid. And so this can get really confusing because a lot of people think that when you have a solar generation facility, so if the city through Green Future Impact, we are going to be on 100% a bundled rec product through solar, we aren't necessarily getting solar electrons into our buildings. That is because electrons from all sorts of different generation types dump into a pool, and essentially everyone's drawing from this pool. It's like a bathtub. You have your faucets going in, and then you have your drains going out. Everyone's getting this kind of mix of electricity. What we can control is the percentages of generation types contributing to that mix. And so from prior conversation, we've broken out these different electricity generation types to explain how renewable energy isn't necessarily carbon free, and that's why we made those distinctions on what we were hoping to achieve through our goals. So you can see here we have for carbon-free electricity, and this excludes nuclear, by the way, because that was off the table. But large hydropower, hydrogen fuel cells, small hydropower, wind, tidal, solar, geothermal. My apologies. Those are all different carbon-free electricity generation types that we can draw upon to meet our goal. But large hydropower and hydrogen are not considered renewable energy types. And that's large hydropower, has some environmental problems and cultural problems that still need to be addressed. But one of the primary reasons that they're not included is simply because they're legacy large hydro, so it's old infrastructure. And then on the right here, you can see PGE's 2016 electricity mix. I got this from the Oregon Department of Energy Biennial Energy Report. And you can see that a large portion of the energy basic mix is natural gas generation, as well as coal, which is being phased out, but then also this large hydro. And one concern about, or something that we need to look for solutions on for renewable or carbon-free energy is simply that the intermittency, the variability of when we get them. So hydro is great because the water can be constantly running, nighttime, daytime, any weather condition. Natural gas is often relied upon because, once again, you can fire up a natural gas generation site at any time and condition. And while with renewables, you need to have a good mix of carbon-free, so wind, tidal, solar, et cetera, to make sure that you're accommodating for the demand on the grid at all times. But that's something PGE is actively working towards because, especially in our region, we have a lot of communities who are wanting to transition to carbon-free electricity. So you have different generation types at all these different varying extents creating electricity, and it's being transmitted over these lines over massive distances to customers within PGE's service territory. To even complicate it further, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can you go back to that slide?
Yeah.
Why is hydrogen not considered?
This is so the renewable electricity right here. This is based on standards from the state. Hydrogen is not considered a renewable electricity type through like RPS standards.
Because we're not currently producing hydrogen through renewable sources, or why?
I think it's a standard that's established by the state based on current renewable energy sources. I mean, I'm sure depending this suite of generation types will be reevaluated at certain points, but right now it is not grouped in with like green E renewable energy generation types.
Okay.
That's something we can check into to find out why it's not part of the RPS.
Yeah, it should totally depend on its source of origination, right?
Yes.
Okay. And it also this might be specific to electricity generation. So hydrogen electricity generation, I'm not sure how that works. We'll look into it.
Okay.
So, like I was saying, to complicate it even further, you have these things called renewable energy certificates, or RECs. And what this does is it's when renewable energy or carbon-free electricity, these generation plants or infrastructure is being developed, it helps create additional market value for those generation types. So a renewable energy certificate is essentially a way to value the attributes of renewable energy. So saying you can separate, you're both creating electrons through a solar panel, but then you're also supporting a clean energy infrastructure. And sorry, Lisa, were you saying something? You saw a little, okay. Anyways, and so you're creating, essentially you're valuing the attributes of the renewable energy creation. Now, this can complicate it because you can unbundle a renewable energy certificate from the generation. And we see this often in large-scale wind farms, say in Texas, where they are creating a surplus of electricity which goes to the grid of the neighboring communities, but then they can sell essentially the value of the attributes of wind energy, and then people who don't have access to renewable energy, or maybe people who are looking for lower cost ways to decarbonize or create carbon neutrality for their own electricity use, can purchase these RECs to cover on top of the grid mix that they're getting. So you can see at the bottom here, RECs don't eliminate the mix you're pulling from. Unbundled RECs don't eliminate the mix you're pulling from. So you still have that bathtub with all these different mixed generation types going into it, and you're pulling from that mix. But what RECs do is it essentially says, I'm covering the types that I don't like to support these other infrastructures elsewhere. Now, when you have bundled RECs, that means that you are both supporting, or you're getting the electrons from that generation as well as the certificate. And so that would be like Green Future Impact, which we are subscribed to. We are going to be getting electrons from that solar array entering onto PGE's grid, and we're also getting the attributes of that solar. Now, this can get kind of complicated because to have a bundled REC means you need to be able to get those electrons, which means that there is some locational extent because of all those transmission lines. There is some locational extent to where you can have a bundled REC. So it would be very, very difficult for us to have a bundled REC in Texas because we don't have the lines that go from that generation point in Texas up to Milwaukee. However, you can, have a generation source on the Eastern Oregon, and that's still connected to PGE's grid, and therefore it would still be a bundled REC because those electrons are getting to us. And then same with bundled RECs. Unbundled RECs can vary in generation types. You have all those different renewable energy types that you can get RECs from, but they can also, unbundled RECs, think of it as like a little paper certificate that you get for producing 1 megawatt hour of electricity. They can also have an age to them. So that 1 megawatt of electricity could have been generated a year ago, 2 years ago, upwards of 10 years ago. But you still have that attribute that you're holding on to that you can sell as a product. Unbundled RECs can also vary in location of generation. Like I mentioned, it can be pretty much anywhere in that Western electricity council, so that Western U.S. portion. And then they can also vary in cost if you have a desirable, maybe a tidal energy rec, which is less common and potentially a more costly infrastructure, there's a potential that the rec created from tidal electricity generation could cost more than something like solar or wind, which could be produced at a different scale. So this is all just to say, you have these two different types of products. You have an unbundled rec product, which it does not have the electrons to it. And these are often cheaper just because you don't have electrons to it, and they can vary from these, really ideal generation types like these massive wind farms. And then you also have these bundled rec products, which have more specificity to them potentially, but there's still some variability on how you define that. A lot of times bundled recs are defined by a regulatory agency, essentially the person determining what do we want to include. So like the state RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standards, they establish what they mean by a bundled rec in that language. And so that's kind of what we're here today, is to really establish what we mean by a bundled rec. And we can go into it and I'll explain a little bit more later on. So talking about the cost of electricity and rec products. So investor-owned utilities, ratepayer.
Emily?
Yeah.
Real fast, did Councilor Beatty have a question? It looks like she was trying to get a word in.
I was going to hold it, but I'll go ahead and ask it, which is, the recs are in essence, as I understand it, like, it's sort of like cap and trade. It's a credits of somebody's generating this renewable energy out there. So who polices that they are what they say they are, and how much quantity goes in one, and all of that?
Great question. So there are a few entities that do it. The most predominant one is Greenway. They are a third-party organization that essentially you have to, when you have a generation facility and you want to create recs, you have to go through a process to get validation from that organization, and then that organization kind of will check off and certify that it's a Greenway certified rec. And they can also set up standards. So I think like Greenway, for example, your rec can't be more than 2 years old. And so, and then there's a separate kind of like marketplace for these recs, and they'll have the certifications with them. So they're very highly managed in terms of, and I would say audited in terms of the accounting for them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And feel free to jump in. I kind of start staring at the screen and then I move away from the faces and I never see if anyone's raising their hand. So the reason why electricity cost is really complicated is because we do have these requirements around ratepayers managed by the utility commissions. So investor-owned utilities or IOU ratepayers, they jointly pay for assets already purchased and managed by the utility. So what that means is in our rates, we are paying for the generation facilities that have already been built. That's those, no matter what, if we agree with them, the natural gas plants, any solar development, PGE builds for their basic grid mix only, that's what we, the ratepayers, are paying for. So usually, historically, renewable products will come at a premium. And that's because you're paying on top of that basic grid mix. And this is historically. You have unbundled recs that you can purchase on top of the base mix. Or you can purchase bundled recs, and that's either through a power purchase agreement or working with the utility to develop new infrastructure. So the utility can own the generation facility that they're creating, or they can enter into a contract with a developer to build new infrastructure and then enter into a power purchase agreement. And that's why it's coming at a premium, is because you're essentially paying for the basic grid mix that you're still getting, as well as this new generation that you're supporting.
And if I can add something, that grid mix includes the RPS standards. So those renewable portfolio standards are part of the basic mix that all ratepayers pay for, and that's stepping up. I think this year it's at going going to be 20%, I think is what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, definitely. And so, and there are requirements for ramping up that RPS. And so, and that's something that we'll consider when we explore into this product, is just the fact that we are going to be entering into a time where carbon-free electricity generation may become more the norm.
Natalie, is there a way to account for the fact that generating energy by renewable sources is also becoming, and actually has already surpassed in many places in terms of cost competitiveness, gas and oil and coal generation? I know it's a little more complicated in our region because of so much hydro.
Yeah, I think this is something that we've been discussing, and I think it falls down to the fact that you're still paying for new infrastructure while you're paying for steel already in the ground. Yeah. And so it's with the current regulatory requirements around rates, I think it's really difficult, especially for investor-owned utility customers, to kind of, because even if you're going into a direct access, so a large commercial customer, and you're now wanting to get your own power from somewhere else, there's still so many fees and costs associated with kind of like disconnecting yourself from those previous infrastructure developments that have already happened and the cost of them.
Yeah.
Okay. And, in addition, when as a ratepayer for investor-owned utilities, we also pay for the transmission lines and the other assets that are delivering the electricity, which further complicates it. Right. And so the cost, so when we're looking at these carbon-free or renewable products, the cost for both an unbundled as well as a bundled rec product, we really see a decrease in cost with economies of scale. And that's both how many people or how many entities are requiring that electricity or wanting that electricity, right? A large demand, as well as just the number of megawatts that are required. So whether it's a few large customers, industrial customers that are needing a whole lot of electricity, which is what Green Future Impact really addresses, right? These large consumers. Or if it's a renewable product like their Green Source product, which has a lot of accounts tied to it because it's a residential product. Now, if you look at the right here, sorry, someone jumping in.
Could I add something to that, Natalie?
Yeah.
On that economy of this, on that economic piece there, the economies of scale is what we're talking about. If we can do a bulk purchase of energy, it's cheaper for somebody to build something larger than smaller and provide that. But that only works to a point. As soon as there's like an increased demand for renewable electricity, that affects the supply because the supply is not there. So it could push a premium for renewable power at some point as well, because there's more demand for a certain commodity than there was in the past. So it always doesn't mean just because somebody wants more of it, it's going to be cheaper, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so that's why we are having these conversations with other communities, and why we all feel like we need to be on the same page, or at least working together to develop any sort of product. Because if we can both benefit from other communities requiring or wanting the same thing, and then we also it could work in our detriment if that increases the market value of some of these products. But I did want to highlight, on the right here, you see two different figures, and this is the cost premium for PGE's current products. For Green Source, which is a residential unbundled rec product, so that's not developing new infrastructure within PGE's territory, right? So that is, you're receiving the attributes from generation facilities elsewhere. That is 0.8 cents, 0.8 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's about, I think I pay for my own bills $6 to $7 a month is what it costs for residential, their Green Source program. Green Future Impact, which is the commercial scaled product that we just subscribed to for a 15-year contract, is 0.1 cent. And that is a bundled rec product. Right. So this is just showing what we're hoping to achieve through some sort of community scale product, a lower, potentially better in our eyes to achieve our goals product that we can offer both residents as well as commercial businesses and industry within Milwaukee. And the reason why, I mean, the PGE can achieve a cost like that 1/10 of a cent is because we did sign a 15-year contract, right? They have a secured demand for the product. They can do it at a larger scale. I believe they got approved for 300 megawatts. So it's a large scale product with a secured participation base. So from this, we just said, you know, staff has been working towards achieving a product that aligns with our carbon-free goals, that we can purchase at a larger volume through a high, steady participation rate from Milwaukee community members at a lower cost. And that's the goal of these discussions when we're exploring a product like this. So on to the product that we've been talking about. So this community clean energy product, there's no name assigned to it, which is why it's kind of hard to talk about. There's a few nicknames that have gotten thrown around, but I'm just going to call it the clean energy product, community clean energy product. It's conceptual through PGE. And it works through a staged approach to achieve our 2030 goal. So, you know, 2030 is only 10 years away, but we can't just put steel in the ground on day one without a significant cost. We'd have to pay for it. And so this staged approach allows for flexibility. It starts with the initial purchase of unbundled RECs, and then a slow but steady development of bundled REC infrastructure, potentially development of infrastructure or access to bundled RECs over time. And on top of it, as Peter mentioned, this stacks on top of the RPS that we are already getting through state requirements, excluding, because remember in that carbon accounting calculator, we're excluding the biomass and the biofuels that are included in the RPS, which is a small percentage, but it includes also large hydro. So this stacks on top of both the large hydro generation of carbon-free electricity and the carbon-free electricity generated through the RPS to then close that gap for the Milwaukee community. The product is designed as an opt-out model because that increases participation. It reflects the community goals and values, and it helps us close that gap to 2030. Was somebody? Okay.
And that's a product for both residential and business?
That's what we're interested in exploring, and so I know that there's probably different tariff requirements for those two communities or audiences, but that's what we're hoping to achieve.
Well, and that would, I mean, that the economies of scale of including commercial just with PPC or PCC in there, that makes a huge difference because
that's actually not considered commercial. That's industrial, which is a third or fourth.
Well, I guess I meant by commercial, I meant all of that. I meant everybody, every user.
Yeah, they pay significantly less than residents, than small businesses, than even large businesses pay. I haven't looked at the rate structure in a while, but the last time I looked, they were paying, I think, 6 cents a kilowatt hour, and we were paying 10 or something to that.
Yeah, it's historically, I think, been somewhere around 60% of what everybody else pays. So who would then be included in commercial? I'm still a little fuzzy on that distinction.
So that's apartment complexes, like downtown stores, businesses,
restaurants.
Even big box. So it's interesting. They've broken it up into four, as I'm recalling. There was residential, not counting apartment complexes, but residential, small business, which is slightly more than residential, large business, which is less than residential, and then industrial. And the large business is like Costco or Walmart or somebody like that. And then industrial is obviously precision cast parts and blunt.
Yeah. Is Bob's Red Mill considered industrial?
Good question. Don't know.
Okay. Anyway, this is just me being curious. I'll stop now.
We've asked PGE to provide us some information on the direct access customers to understand what the volume, how much electricity that they're using, and to somehow develop an engagement plan on, as we develop a product, to go out and have conversations with those customers so they can understand perhaps the co-benefits of what we're providing.
Yeah.
What to provide.
That's great. I'm really glad to hear that because we do have some huge electricity users. I mean, it's stupendous how much electricity it takes to make things out of titanium.
Well, and I will say in our current renewable products that PGE provides, as of December of last year, about 34% of residential accounts take advantage of it. About 4.25% of commercial accounts take advantage of renewable products, and about 2% of the large industrial customers participate in PG's renewable.
Are there even 100 large industrial customers? I mean, what's 2% of 8 customers?
Let me see. I can tell you real quick here. There are 5 accounts that are taking advantage of large industrial accounts that are participating in renewable usage.
So this must be PG territory or Milwaukee?
No, that's in Milwaukee, within Milwaukee, yeah.
They might be purchasing either some sort of rec product to cover a certain portion of their volume.
Yeah.
You don't need to purchase a 1-to-1 ratio, so they may just be purchasing a small amount for some reason.
Right.
Almost 3 million kilowatt hours a year.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I could see like if Precision Cast Parts had a contract to make parts for, I don't know, JetBlue, which has done more of a carbon commitment. Maybe they requested that they be manufactured with Rex or something. Anyway.
Yeah, and it's that, that information on accounts, I think, is rightly so pretty protected. And so we've talked to PGE about when they enter into, essentially, when you have a direct access contract through these customers, it sounds like they do constantly have these open lines of communication to see if they can interest them in rejoining back in as a customer through PGE. And so we've expressed interest to PGE to say, hey, if you're already having these conversations, that would be a great entry point for us to talk about our own community values, because a lot of times, these decisions for a business is made off of economic values. And so that's something that we need to be aware of when we develop or when we're working towards a product like this, is that if they're already getting a very low cost for an electricity product, even the lowest cost product that we can try to achieve may come at that level or around that level. And so that's something that we just need to really convey why it's important to the community, and hopefully they can uptake that value as well. Yeah. And then, so I just wanted to touch on opt-out, so I don't know how many folks here are participating in PGE's renewable products, but there are steps to go through, to sign up for them. Everyone's seen kind of those. Green Mountain Energy is an organization that PGE works with to do door knocking, to go out to farmers markets. There are some marketing materials that go out. PGE spends a significant amount trying to engage the community, as do we as staff members, on these renewable products, and we've achieved 30-some%, which is a great number. PGE, I think, has the highest participation in renewable voluntary products in the nation, and we're still achieving 30-some%. I think that itself is a gap to close, and we need to figure out the most strategic way to close it. And so an opt-out product kind of relieves that burden of accessibility and awareness of signing up for some of these products, while still gives people an outlet to opt out if they don't want to participate. But I think it sends a strong signal on the values and the goals of our community, especially for accounts that are established within the Milwaukee jurisdiction. And
before you keep going real fast, I just wanted to make sure, I think it's probably going to come up later in the night, but all of these things, we recognize that any added cost on some of the homes that we have here in Milwaukee is too much. It's too much of a burden. So part of the discussion that we've also had with PGE and others is making sure that this is paired with a program that would reduce the cost for those who are struggling the most here in Milwaukee, whether that's a more robust rebate program or a more robust assistance program. Every time we talk, we've been making sure that those things happen in the same conversation, and that there's a recognition that this can't be a further burden. So I just wanted to make sure all of you knew that we're actually trying to accomplish both sides of the council goals right now in this with our climate and with our housing affordability goal. I think that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll touch on that a little bit of there needs to be considerations to make sure that no community members are left behind, especially if they want to participate. And there's elements of environmental justice and equity when it comes to accessing renewable and carbon-free resources, especially since frontline communities for climate change, as well as low-income and marginalized communities, are usually the ones who are facing air quality burdens and a lot of the impacts of having carbon-emitting energy. And then, so today we wanted to really go over the different questions that were in that staff report. Essentially, that just highlights that there's a lot of variability in this product design for us to meet our priorities. And then right now, this is, like I was saying, this is our grocery list. This is saying, this is what we're wanting, and we can use these wants to ask PGE to model costs. We don't come to you today with any rates because PGE doesn't know what potential projected rates are right now until we have something to give them to run in their models. So today we're just seeking direction to explore these potential product variabilities. And so this is a picture PGE kindly shared with us. This is, not reflective of actual values. This is just illustrative. But you can see here, this is what that ramped staged approach would look like. So the blue underneath is the current carbon-free mix that PGE already offers. And that's through the RPS as well as the large legacy hydro that's already on the grid. And that's what we said that we were acceptable including into our carbon-free mix. And then what PGE has described here is you can see this light green, the RECs, that is unbundled RECs that you can purchase on the market. So this is similar to their Green Source or their Clean Wind products that they offer already. The dark green is new build infrastructure. And so this is something that we're going to clarify on what we mean by bundled RECs. PGE so far has defined it as new generation infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that. That's what we're going to seek clarification from you guys. But as you can see here, when we increase the amount of new build, we kind of stack these unbundled RECs on top of it to essentially reach our 100% goal. Now, the reason why you see at the end here these small portions of unbundled RECs at the top is simply because you want to provide flexibility in your capacity and demand. You don't want to meet 100% of your demand with new generation infrastructure because sometimes people are going to be using a little less energy, and that actually saves you costs at the end because that way you're not ending up with a surplus of costs or a surplus of energy that you need to go to the market to sell, and you can essentially just meet that demand with unbundled REC products. Are there any questions on this chart before I move forward?
Yeah, I was struggling with this chart in your staff report, and so you've clarified the blue. I was wondering, what it was beyond RPS. So it's RPS plus hydro. Mm-hmm. The dark green, the new build, does that mean, is that sort of, I assume just because of how much of it there is, that's not new build in Milwaukee, that's like bundled RECs.
So this is kind of what we wanted to define on how we want to classify or what do we want from this new build. Mm-hmm. Right now, as it's defined, is it's just new steel in the ground infrastructure that PGE can offer the community. It's up to us to say, do we want that within a certain location? Are we requiring it to be of a certain generation type? That's kind of the direction that we want to seek from you guys. And the answers to those questions will change the cost of the final product. But as PGE has it right here, that would be bundled rec products generated through new infrastructure that is carbon free. That makes sense?
Not necessarily local, could be anywhere.
It has to be within where we can still get the electrons from.
Okay, so the Western grid or whatever.
Yeah.
So if we brought online, if we got somebody to do community solar, or we got some of our industrial area to do solar on the rooftops, that would be some of this green there, or that would be some other category?
So that's something to explore. So community solar, I don't believe would be included in the new build, because community solar is owned usually by a developer or another organization and not PGE. But if PGE entered potentially, this is all potential, and this could be totally wrong, but I can see if they entered into a contract for a power purchase agreement that it could add into that new build. But it also might be, usually community solar works at a subscription where a developer makes an array and then people to help minimize their own electricity costs or service as their own product. So, I think there's a lot of arrangements that could be made, and I wouldn't confidently say I would know if it was included or not.
So there's sort of two questions in that, Natalie. I mean, one is talking about PGE specifically and where the energy is coming for the product that they're going to create. Mm-hmm. The other piece is that we are aiming to be net zero. We don't really care, if half of that is coming from the rooftops in Milwaukee, that's awesome. And that wouldn't be a PGE product. So how are we calculating that into what we're doing?
So the way that I'm envisioning it right now is this is going to be a product that's offered to Milwaukee customers. Another product that is offered to Milwaukee customers is community solar. People have the opportunity to subscribe to a community solar product if they want to, and they would likely opt out of this product instead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Ann.
It's a combo. It takes a village. So all of them are legit ways for us to get power. It's really just a question of whether or not they consider themselves a part of the Green Muni program. But it absolutely counts towards the total, and because we're just trying to offset the total number of electrons used in Milwaukee. So there's a whole plethora of options. Some people are going to have a direct contract to renewable energy that they want to use that's maybe not on their site. There are places that do wind power on our grid that they could do a direct purchase from, and they could choose to do something like that. So there are a whole lot of options. What we're trying to do is just give an easy option for people who are struggling to find solutions elsewhere.
Right. Yeah. So on the piece of community solar being in this, the most, if I'm recalling the rules correctly, the most that PGE could own in a community solar array is a third of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
There's one entity can only own a maximum of a third of it or something. There's a limit.
So the capacity, I would add too. So like Ann said, it's just that community solar just fills in a little bit of the gap that we have between what we have in terms of renewable resources now and what we need by 2030. And the overall solar capacity in PGE's jurisdiction was about, I think they said it was about 2,500 megawatt hours in terms of solar capacity within their jurisdictional boundaries. If you move it out to the east of the Cascades, there's a lot more capacity.
Right, yeah.
But within Milwaukee, it's really small in terms of what impact community solar would have for our total community needs. It helps, but it's a small.
Right.
Essentially, this would just be one of a suite of products that people could participate in. And they're all going to come at different prices, and they're all going to come at different benefits. And something that we've even talked to PGE about is making sure that there's an option for people to participate above and the beyond than what this will offer. That might be something hyper local, but we're just exploring it right now. And this is one easy product that people can potentially participate in. But that's a great question to follow up on. Are there any questions on this chart before I move forward? Did you say something, Peter? Can't tell. Okay. Okay, so this is the first question, and this actually is a great segue, which is, what are the preferred locations of unbundled and bundled rec generation, considering the variations in price based on location? So if we have a prime spot within Milwaukee to develop a large array, it will likely it may come at a higher cost than something east of the Cascades would. And so that's something to consider. So essentially we're looking for both the unbundled rec product, which means that we're not getting those electrons, right? It's just essentially we're supporting infrastructure elsewhere in the region, as well as the bundled product, which we are getting those electrons. What is the priorities or the preference for locations on those?
So for me, I'm less concerned about location. I'm most concerned with causing PGE to develop as much new sustainable generation as possible, as fast as possible. That's my goal. I don't care if they're doing it in Timbuktu, because we're all sharing the same atmosphere, right? It's the same planet. So, but what I don't want this to do is to cause some shuffling of cards and game playing to say, look, you've got your 100% green, and now whatever, Redmond is got less green energy and more coal energy. So my main purpose is to cause them to develop, to actually put steel in the ground and develop as much new as fast as possible. And ideally, because as somebody said earlier, production of this energy is less expensive than coal energy, particularly over the long term, we should see a reduction in cost to our citizens. Even if it's not immediate, it should over time become less and less expensive for people.
Well, that has something.
Cost to the consumer would be my bigger points as opposed to geographics. Thanks.
Great.
So I guess I would say, I agree. I think this is probably going to be, I think there's going to be some cost issues that we're going to need to be sensitive about here. If all things were equal, it seems to me like maybe we're less picky between now and 2024 or so, and we're more picky as time goes on, If all things were equal, if the costs were equal, I would absolutely say we want the infrastructure being built closer to us rather than farther from us, because it's also about, resilience in times of, interruption, times of earthquake or whatever. So, I think we do have an interest that should be more localized in the long term.
Agreed.
That's great. And then, so far what we talked about is kind of the bundled rec product where we're getting the electrons from. When we're just getting the attributes of generating renewable energy, right? So we're just essentially supporting infrastructure elsewhere. Do we have a preference on where that infrastructure is created?
I mean, isn't it by its nature going to be, an unbundled rec is going to be outside the Western grid, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. It gets really complicated, but not necessarily. You can purchase an unbundled rec from
Eastern Oregon
or Washington if it doesn't get, there's no transmission between there and PGE.
Okay.
I don't know if that's accurate whatsoever if PGE is covering that area, but.
So, Councillor Beatty, as an example, when we built our 1.3 megawatts on our convention center, we used the RECs as an item to buy down the cost. So we sold our ability to say that it was powered with renewable energy just so that we could afford to build the actual structure. It got us extra money. And it was more important to get the system installed because it was the right thing to do than it was for us to get credit for it. So that, in that case, the RECs went to Salt Lake City. They bought them, but they didn't actually install the system. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so the rec is, if you're thinking, I didn't think about it that way though, in terms of a new product. So is it a shelf life for a certain number of years?
It depends on what certification pathway you go for them. So it's essentially, it depends on what the consumer requires. You can have a rec that's 15 years old that some people are okay purchasing. And then some people say, I need a rec that's 1 to 2 years old.
Okay.
I think I would probably be more interested in having, there's something vaguely off-putting about the 15-year-old rec. It kind of feels like, yeah, okay, we're kind of over that. I do want to leave the flexibility in the unbundled recs just because I know that that's where we may see real opportunities to do some cost balancing for our residents. But to the extent that we can, I think I would include time as one of the criteria. Sorry, Peter.
I was just going to say that that there are also methods to purchase bundled recs by sort of synthetically combining a unbundled rec from another region and purchasing energy from another place off of our grid that somebody else has already purchased a rec from. So you can combine that and create a bundled rec, actually. So
Because this whole thing wasn't complicated enough, Peter. You have to throw that in.
It gets very complicated. So
Yeah.
Well, and the price point associated with what it costs to build the system does matter in the rec field. There's all sorts of weird things that go into it. I do, just before Natalie keeps going though, wanted to let you all know that we probably need to be done with this conversation in about 20 minutes so that we have enough time to talk about the Open Streets program.
Great.
Perfect, thanks.
So maybe if I can read what I'm hearing that when it comes to unbundled recs, there's less of a geographical boundary we're concerned about as long as we get the affordability values from it. And then for bundled recs, Lisa, I really liked your comment about how for the time being, maybe we are less prescriptive in terms of hyper-localized, but then maybe as time goes on, we reassess that in terms of where we care new infrastructure is built. But I guess the question is to start off for these bundled rec generations, the next question will be defining what we mean by bundled recs, but so if we look at the bottom of the screen here where it's, from the most regional as on the left down to the hyper-local of PGE territory, are we maybe comfortable with that middle field saying that we're okay within the Pacific Northwest for bundled recs to be, so essentially for new infrastructure as long as it's supporting PGE's grid? Peter, I see a funny face from you. Was there any clarifying I need to make on that?
no.
So I know Ann and I had a conversation about this a long time ago where we talked about some of the geographic constraints and we talked about the possibility of having, the cuteness of a sister city where you've got the product is actually built someplace else, but we know that, and so we have some sort of a relationship with wherever that facility is and the community that is getting the jobs benefits and so on and so forth. I think if we have that kind of relationship potential, that would be an interesting way to go. And yeah, I don't know that I care so much about the Pacific Northwest. I mean, I guess ideally, but I don't, yeah.
Sorry. I sort of concur. I mean, a lot of the big solar arrays are being developed in California, Nevada, and a lot of wind arrays that are really effective are being developed out in Nebraska and things like that. And as long as we are causing more new development faster, that's the main goal. I mean,
I want to ask a question that maybe, if it's hyper local in terms of Lisa's question about resiliency, if it's hyper local, then that makes a lot of sense to me to be able to connect to it and repair it faster. However, in a large event like a Cascadia, building resiliency seems to me like you actually want to have connection to someone who's farther away from something like that. And so the connection into that grid is what needs to get repaired, very quickly, not necessarily the more local transmission is actually more vulnerable, and so spreading out. So I actually am sort of I'm on the side of, I don't care where it comes from at all, ever, as long as it's renewable.
Well, I think Lisa's point is right, but you have to get hyper local for that to matter. So the difference between an array in Bend and an array in Southern California in the event of Cascadia is irrelevant, because we're going to be just as shut off from it.
Well,
if we had rooftops full of it in Milwaukee and that portion of the grid could be repaired quickly, then there's electricity there. So,
but even your Bend, California example, I mean, it all depends on where the breaks are in the line. It could be much easier to repair to Bend than it is to, Orange County. I mean, those are all variables that we don't know, but.
Well, and I think to Angel's point, there's, if you look at that map with all the red lines, those red lines are the really big major transmission lines. And we do have bottlenecks in the region that this doesn't highlight. But basically you've got 5 or so major transmission lines that tie Washington and Oregon to the rest of the grid. So I think Angel's right that in the event of a major earthquake event, there would be a priority to fix those, because the entities on both sides of those connections rely on them. California relies tremendously on buying power from hydro in the Pacific Northwest at certain points in the season. Idaho and Montana, it's more of a back and forth, but California really needs that intertie. So that's what I heard in Councilor Falconer's comment. Just that would be a prioritized repair.
Right.
And I also do want to highlight that's, one of the reasons why we're asking these questions, because there is a drastic difference potentially in cost, of smaller, more distributed solar arrays within an urban environment on multiple rooftops with multiple contracts versus one large array somewhere else. And so it's going to be a fine balance of how we weigh these priorities, but this is something that we can bring to PGE to explore and see if they can give us a rate projection. I am going to move on to the next question just because I know that we're limited on time, and this ties into it. So really, we're just trying to lock down what we mean by bundled rec and what requirements must be met to satisfy this definition, including infrastructure age, location, and generation type. What I'm hearing right now is that for our bundled rec, so that electrons plus a renewable energy certificate credit or attribute, we're talking about new infrastructure. Maybe we don't necessarily care about the location as much, as long as it's new steel in the ground. And then we want it to be essentially a carbon-free electricity type. Is there any priorities that you guys have really quickly on the generation type? I know we have wind, solar, small hydro. We have a bunch of different carbon-free types, but I just wanted to throw out there if there was a preference for Milwaukee.
Now, actually, I think a mix is ideal because it creates more consistency, I guess. If it's all wind and the wind stops blowing, right? So the more types, probably the better.
Great. Perfect. Easy question then. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one because this one.
You did have the age question in there. Did you?
Yeah.
New. We said new.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Is that, am I right? And new infrastructure, is that kind of what we were hoping to achieve?
Yeah.
Great. And then, so other community considerations. So, Anne mentioned we don't want to make sure people are left behind. So historically, these renewable products typically come at a premium because of these reasons. But, and this may change as we have increased standardization of renewables in the grid, as we start to transition into a more carbon-free electricity type system, that could change. But for now, so rate assistance for low-income customers, that helps for the base mix, right? So they can't, as of right now, participating in a voluntary renewable product. If you're applying for utility assistance, you're likely not going to get that product because it increases the rate. There's also multiple programs for people to get utility assistance on, and that even is seasonal. For in the wintertime, they can get heating assistance, but then there's also limited funding. Some of it is paid for through ratepayer dollars, and other ones are nonprofit entities offering their own assistance programs. So, we're considering all of these things, as well as potential, legislation moving through that offers flexibility in these rate programs for low-income customers. But the reason why we're bringing these questions is because when we're developing this product, we need to consider the accessibility of carbon-free energy and the benefits of all of these things that we're working on, including energy efficiency and clean energy for all Milwaukee community members. Like I mentioned, frontline communities are facing disproportionate burdens of climate change, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize our community's contribution to climate change and adapt. And so we need to make sure we're not leaving maybe some of our most vulnerable community members behind in the solution. And we need to be considerate of their needs as well and the other values that the community has. So these are the three questions that we received from PGE when we were, or some of the questions that we received from PGE, and we really were hoping to get council direction on when it came to working to provide a product that considers all community members. And these are kind of open-ended questions, and like I said, we just want to make sure we're considering everything when we're developing this product. So I'd love to hear your guys' opinions.
Can you tell us what number or percentage of ratepayers in Milwaukee are getting assistance now?
Yeah, I asked for that information, and PGE is working to deliver it to us. I think they'll have it for us at the end of the week, is the timeline that I heard.
I'd also like to point out that we're probably going to have a lot more in the future, especially over the next 2 or 3 years, as everything tries to settle down again and businesses start up again, and one thing and another. And if this is a opt-out program, then I think we need to do everything we can to make sure that our more vulnerable, lower income ratepayers have the same availability to use this type of product, because that's what we want throughout the city. but that it does not create an added burden for them.
So, just based on what we've already got going, is it more likely to come in at the 0.1 cent premium? Is the 0.8 cent premium that
We just don't know. It's just hard to figure that out yet. As I've explained in other venues, when we went out for the Solar Rise campaign in Utah, because of the way the rates were set up, in some cases, certain rate schedules actually went down with the renewable component. That's why we clarified in the staff report that this isn't an assumption that there is growth in cost. It is an assumption that we need to price it and make an educated decision.
And one of the things that is important when we're looking at this rate is what we project that opt-out percentage to be. The less people that opt out, the more solid the product is for PG, the less risk. So there's that risk. The risk with this product involves that opt-out percentage. So we want to provide something that's inexpensive that people like and they don't opt out on. So there's certainly ways to hedge those opt-out rates. There's financial instruments that you can use as an insurance product that we could perhaps look at and evaluate to see, like, hey, if 5% of the population opt out, it affects the rate by this much. So, those are things that we can look at, and we've had some preliminary talks with PGE about. So, but they need to have some risk too. We don't want all the risk to be on our residential customers or our community. PG should have some risk as well on this.
Well, and I agree, and that's, to my mind, this goes back further in history. Any new carbon-centric development that's occurred in the last 30 years, in my opinion, should have been a risk that the stockholders were taking on their shoulders, because it's not like they didn't know about climate change. So, but somehow it's all worked out to where all of that risk gets to go to the ratepayers instead of the stockholders who made the decision to invest in something they knew was bad.
So do we have any idea how many users within the city of Milwaukee currently opt in to pay those additional costs for wind energy and the other kinds of things? I know I've got a couple of them that I pay for. So wouldn't those who are opting in to some of those factors now, then that wouldn't be the case in the future if we have this new product that serves us better and provides a cleaner environment? So does that help overall, I guess?
It does help. There's about 3,200 residential customers accounts that opt into the product.
And so they're likely to continue. They're the least likely ones to opt out. So that's kind of what we can say to PGE is we have strong confidence that at least 3,200 of our residents will stay in this program. Mm-hmm. Or 3,200 accounts, rather.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for some of these questions, especially, so I'm hearing for the concerns with respect to low-income customers and participation in a community-wide product is very much that we just don't leave people behind, that we make sure that there's some way to either both ensure an affordable product, but then also figure out how to close the cost gap to make sure that they can get the same product as their neighbors. Right. And then for options Milwaukee has available to address low-income customer participation in carbon-free electricity products. This is another open question for you guys. This is something that we're just beginning to explore, and so we'll continue to look at what other current assistance programs exist. But I guess it was just more an open question if you guys have any ideas on opportunities to bridge that gap. And then
if I could add, I think the option would be that the city could provide is some sort of small financial backstop for low-income customers. And that's something we'd have to look at, evaluate to determine how many of those customers there are and what those costs would be. I mean, that would be something that we could at least look at what the numbers are looking like, and perhaps in a future budget provide some sort of financial backstop. That might be an option.
And so I like that idea, Peter. Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to make sure I reiterated Ann's point that assumes there's always going to be an increase, and we don't know if that's the case. So, I mean, I think that should just continue to be an open question until we know.
Yeah.
And I would add too, out in the future, there may be a point based on what we're doing, that our customers get some sort of credit back for the infrastructure that's been built.
Right.
Because depending on the loads and how that energy's put into the grid, we may overproduce that, and we can sell that and get a credit back to our customers.
Peter, I like what you had to say earlier, and I'm just wondering if you've given any thought or can give some thought to how this would work for any sort of multifamily residences where they don't have utility payments that are separate for the different units.
I haven't thought that far yet, but that's certainly something that we would have to look at. Yeah.
That's pretty unusual on electricity. I think more multifamily residential units have meters.
Okay.
Yeah,
it might be more the, I don't know, like a triplex that's owned by someone, or it's an edge case.
Well, and we can ask.
I've definitely lived in one, so I can, just from personal experience, not here in Milwaukee, but I don't think we can assume that doesn't exist here in Milwaukee.
No, I don't think it doesn't exist. I just think it's going to be relatively rare.
I'm sure.
And were you separately metered?
No.
Okay.
I controlled the thermostat for the entire building. It was
Oh, the power.
The curse.
Natalie, you've got about 3 minutes.
Great. All right. Well, then it sounds like we're still going to just seeing if we can pursue opportunities to close that cost gap. And it sounds like there's an interest or potential opportunity for the city to either develop a fund or somehow assist with that cost difference if that happens to exist. And right now we don't know the cost of this potential product. So hopefully it will come in as a extremely affordable rate. And then also I do want to say, for the folks participating voluntarily right now, as I mentioned, there's also potential opportunities for an above and beyond product, depending on what other communities also are interested in. And so we can still have a 30% participation rate in something exceptional. That's just another thing that we can say that we're interested in. So I just wanted to talk about just the path moving forward, and I think this is my last slide too. So ultimately the goal is to achieve our 2030 goal that we've already set out and have in our climate emergency declaration. Like we said, there might be a legislative path needed to develop any opt-out models, and we're in discussions with the PUC as well as PGE and other communities on developing that product. If the PUC, OPUC can approve it through a tariff pathway, that's way simpler. We asked them if they could throw out a number for a timeline, and they threw out about 10 months, which is similar to what Green Future Impact took, which took a little bit more legwork when developing that. That's just an estimate, but it shows how much quicker that would be rather than a legislative pathway. But developing new infrastructure can take 3 to 5 years. So, Even if we can get the ball rolling on this, we still have to expect a lag in time before we actually get those electrons on the grid, which is why we're trying to work fast. Moving forward, we will continue to explore this potential project with PGE, and also understanding that even before the product is, a potential product is developed, there needs to be a level of engagement that needs to happen within the community to really hear their concerns and see what everyone in Milwaukee is thinking. And there's an opportunity for engagement ahead of time about carbon-free electricity and our community values and climate action. And then we're also going to keep having these conversations regionally with other municipalities and counties, because as Peter mentioned, the cost could be driven by volume, but then also it makes it a lot easier for everyone involved if there's consensus and similar products being developed throughout our region. So with that, is there any other questions that you guys have, or direction moving forward, questions that you want us to answer? We're going to talk to PGE more about this product. So if there's anything, you can always shoot us an email and we're happy to enter into the conversation. Super exciting.
And you, you said the Oregon PUC said it would be a 10-month, general process, but how soon are they going to tell us whether they think they can do that process, or whether they think we need to go for legislation?
Yeah, I think they're having a lot of internal conversations. I'm not sure what their turnaround time is for a decision, especially right now. I don't know if they're...
I would point out that 10 months from now, we're in the middle of the legislative session.
Well, and that's the thing too.
14 months from now, we're at the end of the legislative session, and you're sort of out of luck for 2 more years. So
but there's also rulemaking and whatever. It doesn't magically happen at the end. I hear what you're saying, though.
Councillor Beatty, we were explicit actually on the phone call with the PUC about how much time the legislative process takes and why we need to know ASAP. I think that the bigger question becomes, at what point do we stop waiting for them to give us an answer, and do we start down the path of legislation? And I think Councillor Heisey's already working on that path, and we're working with the league in order to come up with some sort of presentation to them about what legislation would look like either way.
Yeah.
Cool.
And those 10 months too, that's an ideal, I think, situation if no other hiccups and et cetera come in. So we do also need to factor in some time where we need to be able to make some changes and critical decision making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank
Great
you.
job.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks.
Mayor, I think we are on to our second agenda item, which is now Open Streets with Kelly Brooks.
Excellent. Hi, Kelly.
Hi. This is the first time I've tried sharing my screen. So here we go. Oh, nope, Scott, you have to let me.
There.
Okay. Can anyone see this? Because now I can't see all of you.
No.
Can't see anything. Just
Okay.
the Brady Bunch.
Select a window or an application that you want to share. All right, I am.
Hey.
It's not working for me, Scott. I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
You hit share screen and you selected the presentation.
Yeah. I did. I mean, it's up on my screen.
You want me to run it?
Probably. Hold on. Let me try one more time.
Okay.
You look like an air traffic controller.
Yeah, that's my goal. All right. All right. Now is it on? No. Okay, Scott, you do it. I can't do it. You got it, Scott?
Yeah, I'm just launching the PowerPoint. Bear with me a second.
Thanks. Sorry. I don't know. I keep opening it, but then it opens just for me, but not for you.
Okay. So Kelly, just tell me next.
Okay.
And I'm trying to launch it.
Okay. So last week thanks, Scott. We talked a little bit about some requests that we'd received to do some closures similar to what Portland's doing to reduce the amount of vehicle traffic on some of our roadways. So Scott, you can go to the next slide. And at the end of that, you said, well, maybe think about a couple locations that we could consider. So just to touch on some of the reasons why we have been asked is that folks are biking and walking more right now because oftentimes it's the only form of recreation or exercise that they have. Oddly enough, in Milwaukee, it seems like what we're hearing is most of that increased traffic is happening on sort of regional trails that we don't have as much access to. And in some of the local streets, they aren't through streets. So some of our local streets are actually working pretty well because they don't connect. The next reason to consider doing it is traffic volumes have been lower because people have been staying at home. They are starting to tick back up again, though, so that's a changing element. And then the last thing is in some areas they have been seeing higher speeds. The one place we did hear concern was on Lake in Milwaukee, and Chief Strait did send out officers to go investigate. Didn't actually find anything abnormal happening there with speed. I believe he said about once every 30 minutes or so they found someone, which wasn't too out of the ordinary. So the higher speeds don't seem to have been quite as big of an issue here, but they certainly have happened. Scott, next slide, please. So when we left our conversation last week, I tried to come up with some basic criteria that might drive where we would do a closure. And so a place that would be successful would be one in which we generally understand the diversion impacts. The traffic levels are pretty low. They're lower speed facilities, and we would expect high compliance with a closure. The next one is really all about resources, and we touched on that last week. If we did this closure, do we have the types of barrier available? Do we have the staff time needed to deploy, replace, and enforce the closure? And then last but not least is kind of community interest and engagement. So is this a place that the community would be supportive of a closure? Scott, you can go to the next slide. So we came up with two options, and Steve is on here because he's smarter than me about these things, but this is the first one that we thought we would just talk through with you all. And where we went with closure locations is it ended up being more about the destination. So this first one, we have a regional park destination in the neighborhood that has been driving more folks to visit the area, and actually seen some photo evidence of quite a few people walking in the roadway on 19th in particular. And so what seemed to make the most sense, if we were going to do a closure here, and again, just for anyone watching, this doesn't mean the closure is about to happen. This is just a proposal to kind of talk things through at this point, is to actually keep as much of the traffic as you can on 22nd. And so to do that, you would need to do a series of kind of local access only barriers and closures. So at 22nd and Bluebird, 22nd and Bob White, 22nd and Wren, 21st and Sparrow, and 19th and Sparrow. And that essentially creates this large kind of greenish area of a bike and pedestrian area. It doesn't mean that local traffic wouldn't get through, but there would be barriers that would need to be moved out. In thinking this through right now, you'd have a couple different options. The one that might make the most sense, given the demand, would be to do this on the weekends, maybe not all week, but on the weekends when you're seeing higher levels of visitation to the park. And then the other question is, and I know this is something we've talked about in the past, and I don't know quite how viable it is right now, but Steve may be able to speak to it, is this may very well be the time that you would need to consider pursuing some kind of temporary parking situation at the Amadeus lot, because you would be cutting people off kind of right at that location that aren't local trips. So this is the first one. And I think before we move on, I just want to kind of come up for air here for a second and see what kind of thoughts or questions you have about this. And also, Steve, if you're there, are you on here? Yep, Steve's right. I see him in his parking lot. So Steve can chime in as needed to help kind of respond to the questions I'm sure you'll have about how this would actually operate.
So the complaint, am I on? Yeah. The complaint I would anticipate out of this one is about the closing of Bluebird and the fact that would, or the, calming of Bluebird, and the fact that would shift more traffic to Sparrow. I don't think the two in between, the Bob White and the Wren, are an issue, because those are, the accessing the neighborhood through those is already not that great an experience, and so not that many people use them. The real places that the neighbors come and go are either Bluebird or Sparrow. And I do think, we would probably hear some concerns from people on Sparrow that we're funneling more traffic their way where they already have a speeding issue.
I think that we would hear those concerns. I also think it's worth trying it, because this is an ongoing it's an ongoing conflict on Sparrow, and I think there's valid concerns there, and I think that we do have speeders. My understanding is that by and large they seem to be people who live in the neighborhood, and fingers have been pointed specifically toward people who live on a particular street, which I will leave out. So I don't actually know that it's visitors that are behind the speeding issues.
Well,
I'm just telling you what I know.
Well, you and I witnessed one yesterday.
Yeah.
Coming to the park and speeding right down Sparrow. I used to think the speeding on Sparrow was just an issue sort of near 22nd and the Amadeus parking lot, where it's so nice and wide, and that people would slow down by the time they got down to the trestle. And I observed last night that's clearly not the case. People speed right through that trestle.
Well, and I don't know if they were speeding or not. So I will say that. It seemed like they were going too fast. I wasn't clocking it. And I do feel like, aside from the story I told you last night about someone who was just barreling down Sparrow, by and large, I think we are seeing slowing in traffic with the number of cars that are parked on Sparrow when it is busy out there. So in some ways, we're creating one problem, but addressing another one to some degree. Anyway, I think we can, it feels to me like something we could try, and if it doesn't work, we revisit the plan and think about doing something else on Sparrow. But there is a lot of parking down by Spring Park, there's that space for 7 or 8 vehicles right off of, is that 20th? The road that goes south. Yeah. And then there's also the several, 6 or so spaces that are adjacent to the park on Sparrow. So if we do close Sparrow, we do lose a significant amount of parking. And I think it's interesting to think about weekends only. Really, when we see very heavy traffic down here, it's less dependent on weekends. It's more dependent on, is it above 70 degrees and sunny? So
That is the issue.
yeah,
It's more about weather than weekend.
Yeah.
it is very heavy on weekends, and it is more likely to stay heavy if the weather goes sideways on a weekend. You know, if it gets overcast on a Saturday, you're not going to see as much of a drop off as if it's overcast on a Wednesday.
So a question for Steve, what if the at Bluebird, what if we left Bluebird open to 20th and had so that people could come in on Bluebird and go down 21st and go down 22nd or 20th and 21st?
Well, what I told Kelly was that you would transfer the complaints of people going too fast on 19th to people going too fast on 20th. I think you're just going to transfer the problem a block over and not solve anything. Everyone's trying to get to the park. The park happens to be on Sparrow, so it seemed to be the logical place trying to take people rather than a zigzag route through the neighborhood with more lefts and more rights.
Mm-hmm. And there are small children that live on 20th that do play in the street.
Yeah, because at first, Kelly, we talked about putting the barricades over on 19th, and it's like, well, I mean, no matter where you put them, if you put them at 20th or at 21st, people who turn off at 22nd are already off the main road that you want them to be on, and they're going to be on a residential road somewhere. So I'm trying to minimize the amount of people on a residential road, and Sparrow just seems to be the one simplest residential road to put traffic on.
Mm-hmm.
And if we did access the temporary parking at Amadeus, it might actually lower the amount of speeding on Sparrow if people park there and walk down Sparrow. So I don't know what it would take to talk to the owners of the land to see if they're open to this idea or not.
They're already being impacted. I can tell you that. There were probably 8 or 9 cars parked up there on the weekend.
I mean, I have their contact info if you need it. And they have been amenable for parking there for, one-off, work parties in the park and stuff like that. I don't know what their long-term plan is for the lot. I think they have been exploring redevelopment of that, but I don't know if they're on any kind of, if that's actually moving anytime soon.
They did put an application in for partitioning the lot, and to allow the partition, I required street improvements on Sparrow, and they didn't like me for doing that. That's the last I've heard of them.
So it might be good to have someone else ask that.
It might be good.
Historically, the former chief of police was in contact with them when they first took ownership about city use and involvement. So we still have all those emails, and we can reach out through those channels.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't know how viable it is or not. It's just something we may want to at least touch in on to make this work a little better if it's going to happen. Okay, if there aren't other questions for now on this one, I think most of the questions that I'll have for you after this are related to what next steps on engagement on both. We have 2. So if it's okay, we'll move to kind of describing the next one. Scott, can you go to the next slide? So the next main generator that we wanted to find an east side location. Unfortunately, a lot of the places that folks are most interested in, we had a real challenge meeting those criteria. On Monroe in particular, as I described last time, the diversion impacts are just more unknown to me on that one. But we do have a grocery store, and people are trying to get to it. So that's sort of where the genesis of this one popped up. It is more complex and involves quite a few more barriers than the Island Station proposal, as you can see. But then the impetus here would just be, can you provide kind of a safe, non-auto trip, and some ways for people to be biking and walking in this area to get to the Safeway and testing it out. So, Steve, do you want to talk just a little bit more about this one?
Well, yeah, we kind of struggle looking for an east side location. What would be good? Some people had thought, some citizens had thought the 29th in that area would be good. But again, I don't think 29th gets a lot of traffic to begin with. And then we looked at the Olson area, one of the east-west streets between 32nd and 42nd, but there weren't any really parks tied to it. And we thought about Harvey, and we thought Harvey, but 32nd and 40th was a little bit too crowded and too much traffic to push it down. Here we chose, because the Safeway being a focal point of drawing people. Monroe is a tricky one because the amount of traffic it has on it, and it seems like Harrison, even though Harrison's really, really busy, west of 42nd, almost all the traffic turns at 42nd or turns at the driveway into Safeway. So the closure basically is meant to be just past the driveways into Safeway or into the business on the south side. And then on 44th, the same thing, so people can access the business by the driveway on 44th, but then hopefully direct them back out to King. We're not sold on this one at all. We're open to ideas on the east side. People have other suggestions. It's just the thought process we went through in landing in this area.
So same exercise. Just let us know kind of what you're thinking. What's your reaction?
My reaction as an East Sider is that this makes a lot of sense to me. It's sort of got the characteristics of some of the greenways that you see closed in Portland. You know, it's the Long, the Llewellyn, the Harrison, the Jackson are all parallel to busier through streets, King and Monroe. I agree. You know, I mean, I live right off of 29th, and so I can certainly, in my own experience, those streets are already operating at pretty low traffic. They're not through connections to anywhere. Not 29th. 30th and 31st don't connect. It's not a grid at all. They're all kind of dead ends. And 32nd is really the through street. And so it really is only local traffic that turns left anywhere. The only designation that you can really think of is the Springwater Trail, and most people aren't driving to that, though I do get that. I mean, there are people who park in front of my house and then access the trail, and that's just fine because I don't own my street. But it's pretty minimal.
I was joking with Kelly that this is literally where we take Allie in the mornings. No, I didn't know it was going to be on this list, but I do think it is fairly slow in the mornings. It seems like a relatively safe space. Families are going there now.
And the way for folks who do need to get around by car, those routes are there. So you're not cutting anybody off.
Yeah.
I think it's great.
Yeah, I think it's fine too. The only other one I had thought about was the sort of Brookside, whatever, Regents kind of loop, getting Ball Michelle Park. That was a route I was taking for a while when the Springwater was closed, and it's actually pretty quiet, just all by itself.
Okay. Yeah, we didn't draw that. We aimed for 2 today, but that's certainly something we could look at. Okay. If any other questions about this one before I moved on to kind of next steps and engagement and all that good stuff?
So these look like really long blocks. I didn't realize. I mean, because it's only 2 blocks, really, right? Those seem like longer blocks than in other parts of town, but no, I think that looks good. How would you close the roads?
We would be using type 2 barriers and signage. So the white barriers. So I think total between these two proposals, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 15 barriers that we need. And
Total, yes.
is that correct?
Yes.
And then, and we confirmed with Peter, he does have that amount of barrier right now. So what we don't have are the signage that we would need to produce to kind of explain what this thing is and why it's closed.
And you're not proposing this one as weekend. This would be just.
I have that same question mark, honestly, for both. And I think if you don't mind, we'll get in. To me, the weekend only question is maybe something we should check in with the community about as well. Because what I'm hoping is that I actually have some buy-in in the form of volunteers to kind of help reaffirm that this is something that folks want to do. And so staffing these barriers and moving them in and out, there's just impacts to all that. So I have it as a question mark for both. Is do you want to do it all the time, or do you want to do it just on weekends? Do you want to do it for a month? Do you want to do it for 2 months? Like all of that is up for discussion.
Also, response of how the length of street, actually this is a little bit longer. The distance between 44th and home is just over a quarter mile, it's about 1,300 feet. The distance between Bluebird and Sparrow is about just over 1,000 feet. So this is actually a longer 2-block pattern than the Island Station. Actually, Island Station 1,100 feet. 1,100 feet from Bluebird to Sparrow, and 1,300 feet here.
Okay. Scott, do you mind popping to the next slide for me?
No.
Oh, one back, I think. Or did I get rid of it?
No, it's back there.
There was one there.
Okay. Oh, one more even. Can you go back? Oh, I'm missing one. All right, stop on the signage for a second, and I'm just going to describe it because I'm missing a slide. So it showed you the spectrum that we've been talking about in terms of how do you engage on something and what level of engagement should you choose. To me, this is actually a pretty high one because it is directly, at least for the folks that are in this closed off area. So I've been trying to think through in a period of social distancing. I mean, I would almost just send somebody out and knock on people's doors with a flyer and say, do you want to do this with this level, with this type of closure? I can't really go door to door right now. So I have a SurveyMonkey tool that we can deploy. It's hard to do it quite this targeted, but we could maybe test something there. I can do a mailing. I can do postcards to these folks and say, hey, we're considering doing something like this. Please let me know if you have concerns. We're looking for volunteers. I may, since some of you all live in these areas, I may need some assistance and some help there to kind of think through what's the best way to check in. I will tell you just the reaction we're getting on lowering the speed limit on Linwood right now. I don't know if you popped into any of those threads on our Facebook page. It's mixed. We have some people that are like, yay, thanks for doing this. And then we have quite a people who are not thrilled with the concept of needing to kind of slow down or being impeded in terms of getting around town. So I just want to say that I'm not so sure this will be universally loved. And that's okay, but I also do think it is important, given the high impact to the folks that are right next to these places, that we make some attempt at talking to them before we put it out. So go ahead, Kathy.
I was just going to say that Island Station NDA is meeting on the 20th, and they have not sent out an agenda or anything yet. So that could be, I think that would be a good place to have a staff person come and give a presentation.
Okay. I think that, yes, and I did have NDAs, but you're right. Thank you. So checking in with the NDAs, and we can do that with Island Station. And before we go, move forward.
Dr. Campbell's meeting was last night, unfortunately.
Okay.
So we would need to go through some other means there.
Okay.
Asking the NDAs to share, I don't know what condition different NDAs mailing lists are on, but oftentimes they're pretty good at getting the word out. And you could also use Jason's Friday update as a way to reach those two neighborhoods.
And I was thinking about I'll get into kind of Carefree Sunday and Axiom in a minute, but even if I did find another method to deploy these barriers, I actually kind of like the idea of having enlisted neighborhood folks that are willing to do this, because to me that's a signal that you want it. And then I actually have a representative, a person from the neighborhood who's there that maybe is, can help respond to questions or help talk things through with folks if there's concern, or be a direct feedback to us and say, hey, this is working great, this isn't working great, but just I need on the ground ambassadors to help make these things work. And I actually, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to point out that there's a chat comment from Jay Panicos.
Oh, Jay. Oh, and he's offering to help. Thank you, Jay. He's so helpful. Yes. Yeah, so I think that would be another great resource as well. Thank you for pointing that out, Jay. So,
Kelly, just so you know, we're down to 2 minutes before we have to be done. So if you can keep going, that'd be great.
I'm going to wrap it up then. Okay, so to be continued with all that, the next thing that I just wanted to highlight is you don't necessarily have to, you can also just use signage. So we do have some variable reader board signs that we get to be deploying on streets that we're not doing actual traffic calming or closures, but that we would like to encourage people to slow down. So we're looking at where we can place that. Councilor Heisey, I did use the sign. It wouldn't say what PBOT sign said, but this is just an example of PBOT sign that you could be posting different places to encourage folks to slow down. And then what was my last one, Scott? Can you go to my last slide? Okay, so this is what my steps are. I said we need to do some engagement and actually test this out with folks that live in these areas and see how they feel about it. I bring that feedback to you all and let you know what we heard. Then we would finalize the traffic regulation and then we would install and deploy. So that's it. Those are kind of the next steps. Any questions or concerns or requests?
On the engagement piece, Jay mentioned Bike Milwaukee. I would just add PSAC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really appreciate the fast turnaround. This was a request that came not that long ago at all. So I'm really, really grateful you all could carve out a little time to give this some attention.
Oh, you're very welcome. And thank you to Steve. I'm sorry, Councilor Beatty.
I just realized the east side one comes very close, but not quite to Homewood Park. So it's kind of a nice piece to connect the park and then the shopping center and
Oh, and I'm really sorry to do this in the last 2 seconds, but I do think, based on what the governor has said last week, that Carefree Sunday is not possible. So we are probably going to be formalizing that in response and letting folks know. We are talking through with Axiom right now to see what assistance they could provide with these types of efforts as well, because essentially Axiom is the entity that's doing the Portland closures right now, and they can coordinate volunteers. I need to see what costs are associated with that. I need to see if we can just do it on our own. Like I said, I'm a little more interested in bringing in support from the neighborhood itself, because I think that's important for engagement. And I also am, to the extent that we can be saving and rolling over funds to the second year, that's important, I think, to me, given that we may still have impacts with sponsorships and all kinds of things. But we are looking into that.
Good. All right. Well, unless there's any very fast questions, we should probably adjourn so that the Planning Commission can go to work. Nope. All right, then we are adjourned. Thank you all. Good job.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.